I'd like to ask you some questions if you don't mind, and then take some calls. And I know we've got some folks that would like to ask you a few questions. I was wondering what you think is the appropriate role of government in our lives.
Well, it's a great question. I think that the appropriate role for government in our lives is to just protect our rights. I think if you read the Constitution, I think that's what the framers were aiming for. I think that's what the philosophy was that drove them in the 18th century. It was a philosophy that put the individual as the sovereign, and the sovereigns granted some of their rights to the government in order to protect the rights of everyone. And I think that is all it's supposed to do. And I think in our context in America, the federal government, and I'm focused on that because that's the office that I'm running for, is a federal office, the main role is to be in the rights protection business and just to follow what's in Article 1, Section 8 in the enumerated powers section of the Constitution. If we followed that Constitution and those powers, I do not think that we would be anywhere near the mess that we're in today.
I think you're absolutely right. The Constitution is a wonderful blueprint for a government, and somehow we have strayed from that path. How do you think the government's intervention in the economy has led to the current mess that America is in?
Well, let's start with fiscal policy, which everyone can relate to, because if you can balance your own family's checkbook or your own personal checkbook, and you look at the finances of the federal government, you can see how it might have an impact. We have overspent, overborrowed. We've used up the goodwill that the American people have with the rest of the world, and it's time to start paying debts back. The problem is that we've borrowed so much and we've spent so much that that it's created an enormous amount of uncertainty in the business community here and around the world. And that's one of the reasons why you see companies reluctant to think about expanding, because they don't know how the federal government's not addressing this issue. They're not talking about how are we going to start paying this debt back. I want people to keep in mind something. We have the debt clock, which does a great service on the web, and it shows you how much money the federal government is in debt, and how much it impacts each of us individually, and specifically how it impacts the people who actually pay taxes. But that's only, I'm sorry to say, a fraction of the story. The additional part of the story is the unfunded liabilities in Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, which David Walker, the former head of the GAO, talks about. And then you also have the backstops to the banks and the GSEs and to the car company, everybody, all these other things. And when you add it all up, it comes out to like $100 trillion, which means that each of us owes $300,000 per person. Now, we can never pay that back, and we've got to get to the business of liquidating that bad debt. But because the federal government is not addressing it, it's creating an enormous amount of uncertainty in the business environment, and that's the reason why we're not seeing job creation. So the whole thing is related to one another. And I have a second part of that answer. If I'm not talking too long, is this okay?
No, you're fine.
Okay. So,
people would rather hear you than me.
Okay. Well, I'm not so sure about that, but the second part of the problem, Bill and Charles, is the monetary side, and this is something that people don't think too much about. And frankly, when they do, it seems confusing, and they turn away from it. But it really isn't all that confusing. The fact is that we have a monetary system now that's based on. We have not even a paper system. We have a digital system with some paper involved. But the monetary supply can be increased at the stroke of a keyboard, and it's not audited. We don't know what's happening with it. And this is really important because August 15th, 1971, the final component of the Bretton Woods system broke down, and Richard Nixon closed the gold window to foreigners. So in other words, foreigners could no longer cash their dollars in for the fixed gold price that we set. And that was a critical time in American history and a critical day for American freedom, because the expansion of the federal government always happens at the expense of your individual liberties. And when you have a loosey-goosey, flexible money supply like that, the federal government can just start thinking of stuff that they want to do, and they can start creating money out of thin air and paying for it, and it always comes at your expense. So it's really, really, really important that we start addressing this monetary issue, and it's incredibly important that the Federal Reserve get audited, because they control the money supply. They control it at the stroke of a keyboard, and they've never been audited. It is the quintessential system that's open for abuse. So I hope I've made it kind of given, for people who don't understand it. I hope I've given a simple enough introduction so you understand why it's so important that we not just pay attention to the fiscal side, but to the monetary side as well.
I think your explanation is pretty clear, but I do have a question for you.
Sure.
Why is it that having a free market in our monetary system is important?
Well, precisely because of that, because of what I just said, but also I want people to consider a couple of other things. One is, since I know most people think that the Federal Reserve's job is to control inflation, but the truth is that they create all the inflation. Since the Federal Reserve was conceived and passed, the Federal Reserve Act in 1913 till now, the U.S. dollar has lost 98% of its purchasing power. It's lost 98% of its value. And it's because we have a system where we're compelled to use these notes, and there's no competition for it. Now, I know that competition brings out the best in everything, and there's no reason why we can't have competition for what money supply we choose to use, and let individuals decide what works best for them. But in this situation, we're compelled to use this. It's controlled by a very limited group of people. We don't know what they're doing to grow the money supply. We don't know who's getting what, and it's just a system that's rife for abuse. Now, there's one other component to this that's really critical, and that's the fact that the Federal Reserve also sets interest rate policy. And this is something that we really need to fight, because interest rates mean something. Interest rates are signals to the marketplace. They are the price of deferred consumption. And that deferred consumption tells business people, tells entrepreneurs what sort of production they ought to be doing. And when interest rates are set artificially low, which they always are, it sends us signals to the business community: produce, because there's going to be expenditures. But the fact is that the resources in society and in the economy aren't there in order to you can never finish these projects that get started. So what happens is, because of central banks setting interest rates, we have these huge booms and huge busts. They're unlike now. We've never seen them before like we have them now. And then what happens is the Federal Reserve will lower interest rates even more, and then defer the bubble, and which makes it even harder to deal with eventually. So for all of these reasons, we really need to have a free market in money, so that nobody controls the interest rate, nobody controls the money supply. It's controlled by the dictates of the market.
And that is a great way to put it. I have heard other people talk about utilizing that system, and you explain it in a way that is easier to understand. I don't know if your background is in economics or not, but you don't speak like an economist if it is. Well,
I'm sorry. I try not to be so long-winded, but this is kind of a involved topic, and I wouldn't call myself an economist, but I'm certainly a student of economics, and this part of the philosophy of economy I understand. So at least I feel. Well,
and to continue in that trend, what is your opinion on the government and moral hazards in the marketplace? Do you think the government creates them?
Yeah, across the board. I think the first thing that pops into my mind is the FDIC. I also think let's look at another example, the SEC, for example. People trusted Bernie Madoff because they figured, oh, well, this guy's getting these incredibly steady returns, but he's got to be legitimate because the SEC is